The engines of the three armored SUVs were already a low, hungry growl, echoing off the concrete walls of the high-rise garage. Jin Woo, the most disciplined syndicate leader in the city, adjusted his cufflinks, his neck tattoos disappearing into the collar of a perfectly tailored black suit. It was 8 a.m., a routine departure for a merger that would change the city forever. Everything was going exactly to plan, until a flash of bright yellow shattered the silence. Nicole, a girl no older than 6, came sprinting down the concrete ramp, her small braids flying, her face a mask of pure terror. Before the guards could react, she threw herself directly in front of Jin Woo's lead vehicle, her tiny fists clenched against the black steel. She screamed with a desperation that stopped 10 armed men in their tracks. "Wait! Stop! Don't start your cars!" Guns were leveled. The air turned to ice. To the guards, she was a distraction, a child who had lost her mind. But Jin Woo didn't look at his men. He looked at Nicole. She wasn't looking at the weapons pointed at her heart. She was staring at the bottom of the SUVs, her eyes wide as if she could hear the very pulse of the machines. Jin Woo stepped forward, his face a mask of calm, calculating intensity. He didn't growl. He whispered, "Nicole, what do you see?" Her hand trembled as she pointed to the ignition housing beneath the frame. "They're crying," she whispered. "The cars are crying, and they're about to scream." The silence that followed was deafening. Park, Jin Woo's head enforcer, knelt down with a tactical light, and in seconds, the blood drained from his face. What they found didn't just save Jin Woo's life. It exposed a Trojan horse betrayal that would trigger a war within the skyscraper. A war Jin Woo didn't know he was already losing. Stay with me until the end, because the truth hidden beneath those armored plates didn't just shock the syndicate. It revealed a traitor who had been sitting at Jin Woo's table for years. Jin Woo lived his life by the rhythm of a clock that never lost a second. In the upper echelons of the city's concrete jungle, chaos was considered a personal failure, and Jin Woo did not fail. Every morning at the penthouse was a study in lethal elegance. Before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon, he was already standing before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, his silhouette sharp against the glass. He moved with a deliberate, grounded grace, the kind earned through years of navigating territory wars where a single misstep meant a shallow grave. As he pulled on his crisp, black dress shirt, the silk glided over the intricate ink that mapped his history. The tattoos were a silent language of fire and tradition. Dragons and peonies that crawled up his muscular forearms and coiled around his neck, disappearing just beneath his jawline. To the outside world, they were marks of a monster. To Jin Woo, they were a skin he was finally ready to shed. He fastened his gold cufflinks with steady fingers, the metal catching the light. Today was the day he would sign the merger papers, a move that would pivot his vast syndicate into a legitimate infrastructure titan. He was tired of the shadows. He wanted a kingdom that could stand in the light of day. The discipline extended to his men, who waited for him in the hallway like statues carved from obsidian. Park, his most loyal enforcer, stood at the head of the line, his head bowed at a precise 15-degree angle. There was no chatter, no checking of phones, and no shifting of weight. This was the iron routine that Jin Woo had forged, a Yakuza-style devotion that prioritized order above all else. When Jin Woo stepped out of his private elevator, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic click of his polished Oxfords on the marble floor. "The convoy is prepped, boss," Park said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "The council members are expecting us at the North Tower by 8:30. Security has cleared the perimeter." Jin Woo nodded once, a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible. He led the way down to the private garage, his mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating the logistics of the merger. He could almost feel the weight of his past slipping away. No more back-alley deals or laundered cash. He was building something permanent, something that Nicole's mother, Elena, and the rest of the invisible staff who kept his world running could finally be proud to serve. They entered the garage, where the 3 black SUVs sat in a perfect, diagonal line, their paint so black they seemed to absorb the dim fluorescent light. The air smelled of gasoline and expensive leather, the scent of his power. The guards opened the doors in a synchronized motion, and Jin Woo took his seat in the rear of the lead vehicle. He watched the back of the driver's head, waiting for the familiar vibration of the engine that signaled the start of his new life. But as the key turned and the first rumble of power stirred the machine, the world outside the tinted window fractured into a blur of frantic, sun-bright yellow. The routine was broken. The iron was about to melt. The air in the garage hung heavy with a sudden, suffocating tension. Park's hand remained frozen on his holster, his knuckles white, while the rest of the security detail stood like statues, their eyes darting between the trembling child and the perimeter shadows. Jin-Woo stepped out of the SUV, his movements fluid and eerily calm. He didn't look at his men. He looked at Nicole. Her small frame was racked with sobs, her yellow dress a vibrant, jagged wound against the monotonous gray of the concrete. She wasn't just crying. She was vibrating with a primal terror that bypassed the intellect and struck straight at the gut. "Nicole," Jin-Woo said, his voice cutting through her gasping breaths like a blade through silk. "Look at me." The girl's eyes, wet and wild, snapped to his. She pointed a shaking finger toward the front wheel well of the lead vehicle. "The man with the blue eyes," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "He touched the bottom. He told me the cars would cry if you woke them up. Please, Mr. Jin-Woo, don't wake them up." Jin-Woo's gaze shifted to Park. A silent command passed between them, one that required no words. Park handed his weapon to a subordinate and produced a high-intensity tactical flashlight. He dropped to his knees, the fabric of his expensive suit dragging against the oil-stained floor, and slid partially beneath the heavy frame of the lead SUV. Seconds stretched into an eternity. The only sound in the vast garage was the distant hum of the ventilation system and the ragged, uneven breathing of the child. Then the beam of Park's light faltered. He didn't move for a long time, his body rigid. When he finally slid back out, he didn't stand up immediately. He stayed on one knee, his face drained of all color, looking up at Jin-Woo with a hollow, haunted expression. "Boss?" Park breathed, his voice stripped of its usual iron. She wasn't exaggerating. Jin-Woo walked to the front of the car and knelt beside his enforcer. Park angled the light, illuminating the narrow space behind the front axle. Tucked deep into the chassis, nestled against the fuel line, was a block of gray, putty-like substance wired to a compact digital detonator. The LED display pulsed with a steady, rhythmic crimson glow, a heartbeat of pure destruction. It wasn't a crude pipe bomb or a simple pressure plate. It was a high-yield C4 charge, professional grade and expertly hidden. The shock hit the men like a physical blow. This wasn't just a threat. It was a masterpiece of sabotage. Had the engine reached its operating temperature, the heat-sensitive trigger would have turned the 3-ton armored vehicle into a fireball, killing everyone within 50 yards. But the real chill came from the realization of the breach. This garage was a sanctuary, a fortress that required biometric access and 24-hour surveillance. To plant something this sophisticated meant the enemy wasn't just at the gates. They were already inside, moving through the veins of Jin-Woo's empire. Jin-Woo stood slowly, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering for a second before he gently rested it on Nicole's shoulder. The child flinched, then leaned into the touch, her sobbing subsiding into small, shuddering gasps. The merger, the legitimacy, the new life, it all felt 1,000 miles away. The iron routine hadn't just been broken. It had been used as a shroud. He looked at the pulsing red light of the detonator one last time, his mind already beginning to map the trajectory of the war that had just begun. The crimson pulse of the detonator cast long, rhythmic shadows across the garage floor, mirroring the ticking clock now running in Jin-Woo's mind. He didn't look back at the car. Instead, he steered Nicole toward a concrete pillar, shielding her from the sight of the men now swarming the vehicles with specialized scanners. The girl was still shivering, her small hands clutching the fabric of her yellow dress, as if it were the only thing holding her together in this cold, gray world. "The man with the blue eyes," Jin-Woo repeated, his voice low, vibrating with a frequency that demanded the truth without needing to shout. He lowered himself so they were at eye level, a tattooed giant kneeling before a child. "Where did you see him, Nicole? Think carefully." Nicole swallowed hard, her braids bobbing as she looked toward the far corner of the garage, where a heavy steel door marked the entrance to the emergency stairwell. "The stairs," she whispered. Mama was cleaning the lobby, and I was playing hide and seek. I went through the door because it wasn't locked. It's never open, Mr. Jinwoo, but it was open yesterday. A chill sharper than the garage air settled over Jinwoo. The stairwell was a dead zone, no cameras, no biometric scanners once inside, and the door should have been deadbolt from the central security hub. If it was open, it was because someone on his payroll had ensured it stayed that way. He was tall, Nicole continued, her voice gaining a haunting clarity as the memory took hold. He didn't look like your men. He wore a gray jacket and he had eyes like ice, blue and frozen. He didn't see me in the shadows. He crawled under the cars and stayed there for a long time. When he came out, he was whispering into a little radio. He said, "The Trojan is inside the gate." Jinwoo's jaw tightened. The blue-eyed ghost was a name that had haunted the periphery of the criminal underworld for years. An elite specialist, a ghost for hire who didn't work for small-time street gangs. He was the preferred scalpel of Hyuk, Jinwoo's former rival, and a man whose bitterness was as legendary as his patience. "Did he see you?" Jinwoo asked, his eyes searching hers for any sign that the child was being used as a lure. "No," Nicole shook her head, but he looked at the camera on the ceiling and smiled, like he was playing a joke. He told the radio that the accident would happen at 8:30. "That's now, isn't it?" Jinwoo glanced at his watch. 8:28 a.m. He looked up at the security camera Nicole had pointed out. Its green light was blinking steadily, indicating a live feed, but Jinwoo knew better now. It was a loop, a digital mask pulled over his eyes while a phantom moved beneath his feet. He realized then that Nicole hadn't just stumbled upon a secret. She had witnessed a rehearsal for his execution. He stood up, the calm mask of the syndicate leader returning to his face, though his pulse was now a war drum. He looked at the stairwell door. The ghost in the stairs was likely still watching, waiting for the fireball that would signal the next phase of the assault. Jinwoo realized the bombs weren't the end of the plan. They were the opening bell. He reached for his radio, his gaze fixed on the heavy steel door. "Park," he said, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. "Seal the building. No one leaves. And get Nicole and Elena to the vault. We aren't going to the merger. We're going to war." The garage transitioned from a site of discovery to a theater of war in the span of a single breath. Jinwoo stood motionless as his team worked with frantic precision to clear the area, but his mind had already left the concrete floor. He was dissecting the geometry of the betrayal. Hyuk was many things, but he was never careless. If a specialist like the blue-eyed ghost had been sent to plant explosives, they wouldn't have been placed where a curious child could hear them crying, unless their discovery was part of the script. "Park," Jinwoo called out, his voice a low anchor amidst the rising panic. "Stop the sweeps on the other vehicles. They aren't the primary threat." Park paused, a portable jammer in his hand. "Boss? If there are more charges, they want us to find them," Jinwoo interrupted, his narrowed eyes scanning the ceiling height. "The bombs were the shepherd. They were meant to scare us away from the SUVs and force us into the safety of the building's interior. Think, where is the one place we feel most secure when the perimeter is breached?" Park's eyes widened as the realization took hold. The service elevators. The internal hardened stairwell. "Exactly," Jinwoo said, his jaw tightening. "They've turned our own security protocols into a funnel. If we had followed the standard evacuation procedure, we would be trapped in a steel box between floors right now, waiting for the doors to open into a kill zone." The realization shifted the energy in the room from defensive to predatory. Jinwoo wasn't just a target anymore. He was the architect of a countertrap. He knew this skyscraper better than the men who built it. If Hyuk wanted to storm the building, he would need a breach point that bypassed the lobby's heavy reinforced glass and the biometric gates. "They won't come through the front," Jinwoo commanded, moving toward the central security terminal near the elevator bank. "They'll use the loading bay on the third level. It's the only point where the structural dampeners create a blind spot for the vibration sensors. Park, take the second squad and vent the fire suppression gas into the third-floor corridor. Don't trigger the alarms. I want them to think they're walking into a sleeping giant." With a few keystrokes, Jinwoo began the transformation. The skyscraper, a symbol of his rising legitimacy, began to retract its claws and harden its skin. Magnetic locks engaged with heavy, muffled thuds that vibrated through the floorboards. The lights in the main corridors dimmed to a tactical amber, while the external shutters of the lower floors hummed as they sealed shut, turning the glass tower into an obsidian monolith. He watched the monitors, seeing the first signs of movement on the perimeter, unmarked vans sliding into the loading zone just as he had predicted. They were moving with the confidence of men who believed their prey was already huddled in a panicked cluster in the service hub. Jinwoo adjusted his gold chain, the light catching the fierce ink on his neck. He had spent years trying to build a world where Nicole and her mother didn't have to fear the shadows. If Hyuk wanted to bring the shadows into his home, Jinwoo would make sure they never found their way back out. "Let them in," Jinwoo whispered to the empty air of the garage, his face a mask of cold, lethal anticipation. "Let them see what happens when you try to burn a kingdom that hasn't finished being built." The transition from the garage to the secure sublevel felt like descending into the belly of a silent beast. Jinwoo walked with a heavy, purposeful stride, his eyes scanning the monitors that lined the corridor walls. As the vault doors hissed open, he found Nicole huddled against a woman whose face was a mirror of the child's distress, yet layered with a weary, deep-seated exhaustion. This was Elena. She was dressed in the utilitarian gray jumpsuit of the building's maintenance crew, a uniform that usually made her invisible to the high-powered men who walked these halls. Jinwoo stopped a few feet away, his presence filling the small room. He looked at Elena's trembling hands and the way she tried to shield Nicole, her eyes darting to the tattoos on his neck with a fear that wasn't just about the current crisis. It was the fear of a woman who knew she was a small gear in a very dangerous machine. "Elena," Jinwoo began, his voice surprisingly soft, devoid of the jagged edge he used for his enemies. "My men found your keycard in the stairwell door. They think you let him in." Elena's breath hitched, a jagged sound that filled the sterile room. She collapsed onto a bench, burying her face in her hands. "He came to our apartment," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "The man with the blue eyes. He said he knew where Nicole went to school. He said if I didn't leave the door unbolted, we would never see each other again. I'm so sorry, Mr. Jinwoo. I didn't know about the bombs. I just wanted my daughter to live." Jinwoo watched her, his face a mask of stone, but internally, a shift was occurring. In his world, a breach of loyalty usually met a swift, permanent end. That was the iron law of the syndicate. But as he looked at Nicole, the child who had ignored her own mother's forced silence to save him, he realized that the invisible staff he had overlooked were the very ones Hyuk had weaponized. Hyuk hadn't just attacked Jinwoo's security. He had preyed on the vulnerability of the people Jinwoo had failed to truly see. Park stepped forward, his hand hovering near his sidearm, waiting for the nod to initiate the standard cleanup protocol for traitors. The air grew thick, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight. "Stand down, Park," Jinwoo commanded, his eyes never leaving Elena. "Boss?" "She compromised the perimeter," Park countered, his voice tight with disbelief. "She was a mother protecting her child from a monster I allowed into my house," Jinwoo said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute authority. He stepped closer to Elena and knelt, just as he had with Nicole. "You aren't a traitor, Elena. You were a hostage. And in this building, I am the only one who takes hostages." He reached out and took her shaking hand in his, the dark ink on his skin a stark contrast to her work-worn fingers. "You and Nicole stay here. My men will guard this door with their lives. When this is over, you won't be cleaning these floors anymore. You'll be in the North Tower office, working in administration where I can see you." The choice was clear. Hyuk had used fear to turn the shadows against him. Jinwoo would use protection to turn them into a shield. He stood up, his resolve hardening like cooling steel. He had spent his life building a kingdom of fear, but today he would fight for the people who actually made that kingdom worth saving. He turned toward the door, his mind shifting back to the tactical map. The hit squad was inside, but they were about to find out that Jinwoo's shadows were no longer empty. The amber emergency lighting cast long, skeletal shadows across the third-floor corridor, turning the sleek corporate hallway into a labyrinth of shifting gold and deep obsidian. The air was unnaturally still, thick with the faint, sweet scent of the neutralized fire suppression gas that Jinwoo had ordered into the vents. It was a silent hunter's atmosphere. At the far end of the hall, The heavy magnetic seals of the loading bay hissed open, a sound no louder than a sharp intake of breath. Hyuk's hit squad moved with the practiced fluidity of ghosts. 6 men, clad in matte black tactical gear that absorbed the dim light, slid through the doorway. They moved in a staggered diamond formation, their suppressed weapons sweeping the empty air with mechanical precision. They were confident, guided by the belief that the accident in the garage had sent Jinwoo's security into a tailspin of panic. To them, the silence of the building was the silence of a tomb they had already dug. What they didn't see were the eyes watching from the ventilation grates and the darkened alcoves of the executive suites. Jinwoo watched the feed from a handheld tablet in the sublevel, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. Beside him, Park gripped a radio, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. They watched as the lead mercenary reached the first intersection, signaling for his team to split. They were heading for the service elevators, the very funnel Jinwoo had predicted. Now, Jinwoo whispered. The transition was instantaneous. The amber lights flickered and died, plunging the corridor into a total, suffocating darkness that even high-end night vision struggled to pierce. From the shadows, the silence didn't just break. It shattered. Jinwoo's enforcers didn't use firearms. They used the environment they had spent years guarding. A heavy steel security shutter slammed shut behind the invaders, sealing the exit with a thunderous boom that vibrated through the floorboards. Before the hit squad could recalibrate, the shadows themselves seemed to strike. Park's men, equipped with thermal mapping lenses, emerged from hidden wall panels and recessed doorways. It wasn't a firefight, it was a surgical extraction. The first 2 mercenaries were pulled into the darkness of side offices without a sound, their tactical lights spinning uselessly across the ceiling before vanishing. The remaining 4 scrambled, back to back, their suppressed muzzles flashing in short, desperate bursts as they fired at ghosts. But Jinwoo's men moved with the terrifying coordination of a single organism. A flashbang detonated at the end of the hall, not to blind, but to disorient the invaders' audio sensors. In that split second of sensory overload, Jinwoo's enforcers closed the distance. In the sublevel, Jinwoo didn't smile, but his jaw set with a grim satisfaction. He could hear the muffled thuds and the frantic, garbled radio chatter of Hyuk's elite squad being dismantled piece by piece. They had come to find a panicked Mafia boss hiding in a corner. Instead, they had walked into the jaws of a disciplined machine that knew every inch of its territory. "The 3rd floor is clear, boss." Park's voice crackled over the comms, his breathing only slightly elevated. "For neutralized, 2 captured." The blue-eyed ghost wasn't among them. Jinwoo stood, the blue light of the tablet reflecting in his narrowed eyes. He adjusted his gold chain, the weight of it familiar and grounding. He knew where the ghost would be. Hyuk wouldn't leave the final blow to the infantry. He would be at the top, waiting for the smoke to rise. Jinwoo turned toward the private elevator, his shadow stretching long and sharp across the vault floor. The shadows had moved, and now it was time for the king to step into the light. The ascent to the rooftop was a silent, vertical journey through a building that had become a tomb for Hyuk's ambitions. When the elevator doors finally hissed open, the roar of the city's morning wind rushed in, cold and unforgiving. The helipad was a vast, exposed stage of painted concrete, suspended hundreds of feet above the streets Jinwoo had spent his life conquering. At the center of the landing pad stood Hyuk, his gray overcoat whipping violently in the gale, his eyes, those frozen blue eyes Nicole had described, fixed on the elevator bank. Hyuk wasn't cowering. He stood with the relaxed posture of a man who believed he still held the detonator to Jinwoo's life. In his hand, he toyed with a high-end mobile device, its screen glowing with the tactical blueprints of the building. He looked at Jinwoo, taking in the blood-dark ink on his neck and the expensive black suit that remained impeccably creased despite the chaos below. "You're late for your merger, Jinwoo," Hyuk shouted over the wind, his voice thin and mocking. "But I suppose the legitimate world can wait for a man who's too busy chasing ghosts in his own garage." Jinwoo stepped onto the rooftop, his Oxfords clicking against the weather-beaten concrete. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even signal to Park, who remained in the shadows of the doorway. He simply walked toward his rival, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness. Hyuk let out a jagged laugh, shaking his head. I heard the chatter on the comms before your boys jammed them. A janitor's brat? Jinwoo? That's what brought down the great dragon of the South. You've gone soft. You've spent so much time trying to buy a seat at the clean table that you've forgotten how to smell a trap until a child points it out for you. Hyuk stepped closer, his ice blue eyes gleaming with a mixture of hatred and pity. You think you're building a legacy? You're building a glass house. You traded your teeth for a gold chain and a title. The moment you started caring about the invisible people, the help, their children, you became a liability. Mercy is a luxury for men who aren't in our line of work. It's a weakness. And it's why you're standing here alone while your hit squad is being zip-tied in the basement. Jinwoo stopped 10 feet away. The wind tore at his hair, but his gaze never wavered. He looked at Hyuk not as a rival, but as a relic, a ghost of a violent past that no longer understood the world it was trying to burn. You call it soft, Jinwoo said, his voice low but carrying with a lethal resonance that the wind couldn't touch. I call it an investment. You looked at Nicole and saw a tool to use as a warning. You looked at Elena and saw a lock to be picked. You missed the only thing that mattered. Hyuk sneered, raising his phone. And what's that? Some poetic nonsense about heart? I have a federal strike team 3 blocks away waiting for my signal. I have your bank records. I have everything. You have nothing, Jinwoo replied, the gold chain around his neck catching a stray beam of sunlight. Because while you were busy mocking a child's warning, you forgot the most basic rule of the hunt. You never look at the bait. You look at who's holding the line. Jinwoo checked his watch. 9:02 a.m. The time for the merger had passed, but a different kind of deal was about to be closed. He looked past Hyuk toward the horizon, where the first signs of a different kind of storm were beginning to gather. The masterminds had arrived, but the game had already changed. The wind on the helipad howled with a renewed fury, but the atmosphere between the two men had turned deathly cold. Hyuk tapped his phone screen with a frantic, rhythmic aggression, waiting for the signal that his leverage had taken hold. He expected to see Jinwoo's empire crumbling in real time. Bankruptcies, arrests, and the total collapse of the North Tower merger. But as the loading icon spun and settled, the color began to drain from Hyuk's face, leaving him looking more like a ghost than the man with the blue eyes Nicole had feared. Something is wrong, Hyuk muttered, his thumb hovering over a frozen balance sheet. Jinwoo didn't move. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, the gold links of his watch glinting. You were so focused on the building, Hyuk. You treated the skyscraper like a fortress to be stormed. You thought if you broke the walls, you'd own the man inside. Jinwoo took a slow, deliberate step forward. But I haven't been a man in a fortress for a long time. I've been a man in a network. Hyuk looked up, his eyes wide and fractured. What did you do? While you were busy intimidating janitors and planting C4, my legal team wasn't at the merger, Jinwoo said, his voice a steady, low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through the very concrete of the helipad. They were in the Cayman Islands. They were in Zurich. They were in the digital back alleys where you hide the money that pays for those tactical suits and blue-eyed assassins. A notification finally pinged on Hyuk's phone, but it wasn't the victory message he anticipated. It was a series of liquidation alerts. One by one, the offshore accounts that funded his private war were being flagged, frozen, and redirected under the authority of the very corporate merger Jinwoo was supposed to be attending. You see, Hyuk, the world is changing, Jinwoo continued, his gaze piercing. The clean table you mock has rules, and those rules are far more efficient at destroying a man than a block of C4. You tried to use my humanity against me by targeting a child, but all you did was give me the justification to initiate a hostile takeover of your entire life. By the time the sun sets today, you won't just be an enemy. You'll be a pauper with no one left to pay for your protection. Hyuk lunged forward, reaching for a weapon tucked into his overcoat, but he stopped when he heard the synchronized metallic clicks from the shadows. Park and 4 other enforcers stepped onto the roof, their suppressed rifles aimed with mathematical precision. The war was over before the first shot could be fired. The tactical advantage Hyuk thought he possessed had been a phantom, a shadow play choreographed by a man who had learned that the most effective way to win a fight is to ensure the opponent can no longer afford to stand. Jinwoo looked at the man who had tried to burn his world. Hyuk looked smaller now, his gray coat no longer an omen, just a piece of fabric flapping in the wind. The merger wasn't just about my legitimacy, Jinwoo whispered, the light catching the fierce ink on his neck. It was about your obsolescence. He turned his back on Hyuk, looking out over the city. The North Tower stood tall in the distance, a symbol of a future that was finally within reach. The sirens were coming, but they weren't for him. They were the sound of the old world being swept away. The rooftop fell into a sudden, eerie stillness as the state authorities moved in to collect the hollow shell of Hyuk's ambitions. The roar of the wind seemed to soften, transitioning from a battle cry to a weary sigh. Jinwoo stood at the edge of the helipad, his silhouette a sharp, dark line against the sprawling horizon of a city that no longer looked like a battlefield, but a garden in need of tending. He didn't stay to watch the arrests. He didn't need the satisfaction of seeing his rival in cuffs. The weight of the old world was already sliding off his shoulders, replaced by a gravity that was quieter, deeper, and far more demanding. When he returned to the sub-level vault, the heavy steel doors opened to reveal a scene that shifted the air in his lungs. Elena and Nicole were still there, huddled together on the bench. The terror that had defined their morning had been replaced by a cautious, fragile hope. As Jinwoo stepped into the room, Nicole stood up, her bright yellow dress wrinkled but still defiant against the sterile gray walls. She didn't flinch this time. She looked at the man with the tattoos and the gold chain, and for the first time, she didn't see a monster. She saw a shield. Jinwoo knelt one last time, the movement now instinctive rather than tactical. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, placing it on the bench beside Elena. It was the device that held the keys to his empire, the encrypted codes to 1,000 dark doors he was now sealing forever. The cars aren't crying anymore, Nicole, he said, his voice carrying a warmth that would have been unrecognizable to the man he was just 3 hours ago. He turned to Elena, whose eyes were wet with a relief so profound it looked like pain. My enforcers are transitioning into a private security firm. Park will oversee the transition. You and the rest of the staff, you aren't just employees of a building anymore. You are part of the foundation. Your daughter's courage bought a future for this city that I couldn't see on my own. Jinwoo stood and looked at Park, who was waiting by the door. The enforcer offered a silent, deep bow, not out of the ironclad fear of the syndicate, but out of a new, burgeoning respect for a leader who had finally found something worth more than territory. Jinwoo reached up and unbuttoned his collar, the gold chain catching the light as he pulled it over his head and handed it to Park. It was the final link to a life built on the threat of the blade. I'm going to the North Tower, Jinwoo said, his voice steady and clear, but not for a merger. I'm going to sign the papers that dissolve the syndicate and establish the foundation. We're done with the shadows. As he walked out of the vault and toward the sun-drenched lobby, Jinwoo realized that his power had never truly been in the ink on his skin or the fear in men's eyes. It was in the hands that held the line for those who couldn't hold it themselves. He stepped through the glass doors and into the morning light, leaving the Mafia boss behind in the darkness of the garage. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't walking toward a war. He was walking home. The true strength of a king is not measured by the fear he instills, but by the lives he protects. Jinwoo's empire nearly crumbled because he overlooked the invisible souls in his shadow, yet it was saved by the smallest voice among them. This journey proves that mercy is not a descent into weakness, but an ascent into true power. When we value the vulnerable and listen to the unheard, we build a kingdom that no bomb can shatter. Integrity is the only fortress that truly stands the test of time and betrayal. We have come to the end of this story. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and what you would have added or taken out from the story. Do not forget to like and subscribe to the Cinema Corner. Thanks for watching. Sit back, relax, and let me tell you another story.